Yeah, you don't bet against James Cameron. When Avatar: The Way of Water was finally released after over a decade of production and interminable discourse about its alleged waning cultural impact, the naysayers, both critical and audience, were forced to eat shit when the almighty Jimmy C released a sequel that blew its predecessor out of the water. Sorry, had to do it. While also synthesizing the filmmaker's greatest strengths in what one could reasonably argue to be his magnum opus. The massive critical and box office success would lead a discerning filmgoer to conclude that this franchise would be his Star Wars, a tremendously executed franchise layering an unprecedented spectacle atop an archetypal story that would travel the globe. But there's a reason the franchise caught so many strays in the decade after the world was introduced to the Na'vi, because the fact of the matter is that no matter how much money these movies make, they're fucking weird, dude, and I say that with incredible affection. It's part of the charm. When I walked out of Fire of Ash, my immediate thought was, okay, this isn't Star Wars, but am I crazy for thinking that this is Pirates of the Caribbean? And I mean that as the highest possible compliment. I love Gore Verbinski's Pirates trilogy. Specifically with Fire and Ash, I feel it resembles his At World's End, a sprawling Hollywood work of operatic scale, stacking consequence upon consequence until the screen buckles under the weight of its own ambition. With Fire and Ash, Cameron has shamelessly embraced the anime and video game inspirations lurking at the margins of the first two films and dragged them dead center proudly and without apology. Perhaps this freedom is the bravado that comes with proving your haters wrong time and time again, but whatever the explanation, the finished work is a non-stop cascade of the most jaw-dropping, radical filmmaking you can possibly imagine. Actually, you know what? I'm going to push that one step further. This is filmmaking you can't possibly imagine until you've seen it. The experience of seeing a third Avatar movie in theaters is the sort of thing that makes lifelong movie fans. It is such an overwhelming experience, so incredibly layered with characters and spectacle. It's fucking awesome, dude. It's such a treat to have something like this during a time when it's like everything is so focus tested, and this is cinema, pure and distilled. Full stop, no slop. Yeah, I know that sounds like a Mountain Dew ad, but look, it sounds like something that Quaritch would believe in. But here's the thing the limits of online discourse fail to fully capture. Fire and Ash is not merely a spectacular delivery system. It is a brilliantly nuanced exploration of multiculturalism, grief, and the irreversible damage that colonialism leaves behind. Cameron is not content to stop at, oh, colonialism is bad, because he already made that film, and even its most adoring audience could fall prey to dismissing its central storyline as Pocahontas or Dances with Wolves, and I've already kind of gone down debating that whole thing in the first video I did on the first Avatar movie, and while I think that's a bit reductive, even though I do understand why it is labeled as such, but regardless, the truth is, Cameron is taking his time to craft something so much deeper and more impactful. Fire and Ash is his answer to short-sighted criticism, delivered with the profound alien rumble of a Tolkien vibrating the surface of the ocean with its every word. The film acknowledges that unthinkable harm has been done to Pandora and proceeds to ask the harder, uglier question of what comes next. How do cultures coexist after the wound has been opened and reopened? How do people carry grief without letting it calcify into nihilism? These are not easy questions to answer, and I don't think Cameron himself necessarily has all the answers, but I think what makes it so cathartic and profound is that it's a reflection of the world we live in, the crisis we are currently experiencing all around us. I mean, what is Avatar if not a filmic representation of ourselves and the world we live in? The central themes of Fire and Ash are so potent and timely, resonating uncomfortably close to our reality. Now, Cameron, forever a long-haul trucker in spirit, has never been one to mince words. In fact, he has been characteristically direct about the intention of the Avatar project. These scripts were written well over a decade ago, and the world eventually caught up to them. He has described the film's central thesis as follows.
The fire of hate leaves only the ash of grief. That grief, that loss, that trauma fuels the fire of hate.
For Cameron, this is not merely a literary conceit, but something he sees playing out in conflicts like in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan. These are generational conflicts whose pain is amplified through time in all directions under the banner of justified vengeance. The Ash people, for example, are not alien villains invented for a franchise installment. The instantly iconic Varang is not a mustache-twirling villain, although I guess it would be more of like a hip moving villain. Yeah. a hip-shaking villain. Fuck me. But a protector of a dying way of life, animated by righteous fury. There are people wearing their trauma like a second skin, so consumed by what was done to them that they have anointed their pain as a theology and started spreading it to everyone in range. This is no god, only fire. The genius and nuance of the film's construction is that it doesn't present this loop as something endemic only to the villains. No, Neytiri is nearly suffocated by her grief. She is arguably the most beloved character in the franchise, a woman who has earned every ounce of the audience's love and sympathy, and yet her grief perverts into a bigotry so intense it veers into homicidal cruelty. Her hatred of the Sky People is rooted in the loss of her child and the loss of her community, her home, her father, but her anger becomes directed at Spider, a naked human child raised within the Na'vi culture and invited into their family. Despite his blood relation to Quaritch, he's not responsible for this cycle of generational violence. He didn't invade, he didn't kill, he ultimately chose the good of the Na'vi over his human family, and still, Neytiri cannot look at him without seeing the enemy. Cameron doesn't soften this. He doesn't let her off the hook by making it only subtext. The film constantly prods at the idea of whether or not her hatred outweighs her empathy. She also just so happened to fall in love with a human and have hybrid children. Does that mean she hates the human parts of them as well? It might, and that's something Neytiri needs to sort out here. Does her hatred outweigh her empathy? It's stuff like this, where Cameron explores the line between imposing one's will onto an existing culture or environment and respectfully integrating into a culture without appropriating or losing your own identity. Jake's arc is equally unsparing. He's a man buried in stoic machismo, a hangover from the kind of human masculinity he was steeped in before his transformation. Neteyam's death, instead of breaking him open, closed him down. The big-hearted Papa Sully we meet at the beginning of The Way of Water is kinda on life support by the time we reach Fire and Ash. The once goofy dad has now buried himself in fortification of shelter and logistics in the work of protecting his family while maintaining a firewall to mitigate paternal emotions. He has stopped communicating with his wife, stopped listening to his son, and he contemplates horrific solutions because horrific solutions have the comforts of decisiveness. The film understands that this kind of grief is its own form of destruction, slowly burning the bridges to those he loves out of a misguided sense of duty. The fire is just as destructive as any conjured by the deadly Varang. It simply burns slower and quieter. Jake has accepted that he cannot run from the threats chasing him. He has not yet accepted that reclaiming the mantle of Taruk Maktal is required to face them, because to do that, he would have to confront the cost. Our noble hero is earnestly afraid in the deepest sense of becoming the beast and losing himself to the violence and collateral damage that are inextricably entwined with that power. And this isn't helped by the fact that Neytiri is starting to see the more human aspects of Jake, ultimately ostracizing him further, making him feel less and less like he belongs, even though he was brought into this culture by Neytiri. Jake, like Spider and Kiri to an extent, is made to feel like he'll always be different, that he's just an alien, a freak. And it's important for Jake and Kiri and Spider to recognize that they're different, but they shouldn't be made to feel lesser than. And that's the problem. Jake is struggling with someone like Neytiri not seeing him as Na'vi, and so he struggles to see himself as really anything, which only causes him to shut down more. Jake, Spider, and Kiri, the Outcasts, they need the most important Na'vi person in their life, Neytiri, to see them for who they really are, to make them feel it's okay to be who they are. The community they're a part of can't outcast or treat them as a pariah, and there also has to be an acknowledgement on the parts of the person who was invited in that they are different. Everyone needs to recognize and understand that their actions, the way they treat people that are part of their community, can have some major ramifications that only perpetuate a divide, that perpetuate a fissure imposed on them by colonialism. Because ultimately, the way to fight colonialism is to get everyone on board, is to embrace multiculturalism. And then there's Quaritch. Good old blue Quaritch. I know the themes we're discussing are heavy, but I mean, goddamn, is Stephen Lang having the fucking time of his life in this movie, and it shows in every single frame. Miles Quaritch has become probably and magnificently the MVP of the entire series, and I'm sure I said that that in the last Avatar video, but like, it just bears repeating. His continued identity crisis is the most compelling thread in a film full of compelling threads. He is someone who resists the pull of the freedoms his new Na'vi body affords him, but can't help indulging in them in ways that feel congruent with his mission. This is a rationalization that the film sees clearly, even when he does not. He admires and respects the way the Sullys have raised his son, and he desperately wants to be the father Jake is. The brief section of the film that puts Jake and Quaritch in close collaboration is a huge moment for people that love this franchise, but not one that feels cheap or forced. It's these two people who have opposed one another learning to come together to work together. I mean, these men, for all of their differences, can't help but share certain values. And yet, Quaritch cannot bring himself to move past Jake's betrayal long enough to act on that desire. He is a violent, vindictive man struggling to reconcile his mission with the reality that the RDA, the colonial power, do not have his best interests at heart. He has spent his entire adult life operating by a military code that promises a handsome reward for loyal service, and yet that cause has already killed him once. But the only alternative is to consider the terrifying open-ended pursuits of defining himself on his own terms. A question that constantly haunts the film. Is it too late for Miles Quaritch? What elevates Quaritch beyond stock villainy is that his back and forth, his constant flip-flopping, which I know can be an annoyance to some, but I actually find to be a very compelling aspect to the character, makes for the most emotionally compelling arc in the film. Quaritch is not literally the man whose memories he carries. He's a new person, inhabiting a body built for a world he was trained to conquer, carrying the grudges and traumas of a human life he did not fully live. His dawning realization that he is not Quaritch, but a different person who must decide what that means, is the central question of his arc. And his relationship with Varang is a dark mirror of Jake and Neytiri, two violent, angry people bonded over a shared contempt for those who failed them. And yet, neither of them seems comfortable interrogating their own dynamic in any meaningful way. Where Jake and Neytiri yearn to understand one another, work through their differences, see one another for who they truly are, and celebrate those differences, Quaritch and Varang are the toxic foil. They're united by a rejection of their respective cultures. Varang herself is arguably the film's greatest achievement, not only because her introduction in the first teaser immediately set the internet alight with what could diplomatically be referred to as conflicted arousal. Varang is a standout villainess who is sexually charged, warlike, and secular in the most unsettling way. She's someone who seems to get off on violence. She's a Na'vi who feels she was forsaken by Awa, has responded by anointing herself God in Awa's place. Her internalized hatred of her own people was curdled into a willingness to ally with the colonizers who helped break them. With Varang, Cameron is exploring what happens when faith collapses entirely under the weight of unanswered trauma. The Ash people are not simply nihilists, they're a congregation without a deity, filling the void with fire because fire at least does something. She's looking to inflict the pain that she feels onto the world around her, which is similar to Quaritch wanting to take his aggression, his anger, his resentments of the Sullys out on everything around him. If you want to use breathtaking visuals to enhance your storytelling, just like blockbuster god James Cameron, then you should take a look at today's sponsor, Storyblocks. I know better than anyone how hard it can be to find video assets that look great, are easy to implement, and don't cost the equivalent of Avatar's box office return to license. So Storyblocks is a goddamn lifesaver. I've been using their service actually even before this sponsorship. It's something that has helped fill the gaps when I'm trying to convey ideas but don't necessarily have the assets at my disposal, don't necessarily have the footage, and can't just go out and shoot it. With their huge stock library of creative assets including footage, music, sound effects, and templates, Storyblocks allows you to add flair and style to your videos with ease so you can focus on telling your story in the strongest, cleanest way possible. Under one fixed fee, everything you download is fully pre-licensed and ready to use, so you can rest easy knowing that you don't have to compromise your creative vision in order to appease copyright systems, and your channel will be free of strikes and claims. Not only that, but all of their assets are 100% human-made, thanks to a wide array of artists and filmmakers contributing worldwide. And let me tell you, it is so nice to browse through truly inspiring and unique visuals that have been produced produced by real people in an age where AI is just kind of taking over and running amok. So you can really stand out in a crowded market by using legitimate stuff like this. So what are you waiting for? To start telling better stories with the tools I personally use, head to storyblocks.com/filmspeak. They're offering 15% off any annual plan for a limited time, and that discount is only available through my link. That's storyblocks.com/filmspeak, and a huge thank you to Storyblocks for sponsoring this video. For 2 films now, the franchise's critics complained that the Na'vi were kind of a monolith, a noble, undifferentiated collective invented to make a point about colonialism with any nuance or complexity. Fire and Ash, on the other hand, dismantles that reading so thoroughly that the franchise subtitle is literally named after the faction that busts the door open. The Ash people, the Wind Traders, the fractures within the Metkaina, the Tulkun with their own councils, ornamentation, moral codes, and ideological splits, Payakan's exile and his rogue stance within his pod. This is Cameron making good on a promise the first film was always pointing toward, that Pandora is a world, and that world contains multitudes. Also, much like Tony Gilroy's stunning work in Andor, laundering radical politics through large-scale studio filmmaking by exploring the utility of violent resistance, Cameron is exploring the idea that an indigenous population need not be noble or subservient in the mind of their oppressor to deserve respect. I've talked a lot about multiculturalism, and it's because that's really what this movie is about. The multicultural argument the film is making is specific and unsentimental. It doesn't celebrate assimilation, nor does it condone isolation. It interrogates the space between them. Jake's weapons, for example, the modifications and tactical ideas that he gives to the Reef clan pose a genuine question of whether or not he's overstepping. Is he imposing change onto a culture he has chosen rather than earned the right to alter? The film holds that tension without resolving it cheaply. You understand where he's coming from. There needs to be a fortification of their defenses, their weaponry, in the face of an impending threat. Is it his place to impose these tactics onto the people? Cameron makes sure you understand there is a delicate balance disrupted by this purported pragmatism. Because ultimately, is he really protecting the Na'vi by diluting their culture with the violent strategies deployed by the Sky People? True integration, the narrative insists, means bringing outside ideas that complement and honor an existing culture, not replacing them entirely. And on the flip side of that, it's about not resisting change at all costs. Loak and Payakan are at the core of this argument. 2 outsiders, one a hybrid child who doesn't fully belong to the culture he was raised in, the other an exile whose pod cast him out for refusing their pacifism. They find each other across species lines and invent their own form of belonging. This bond is not presented as a fantasy or a frictionless connection, but it's earned through shared grief, rejection, and a mutual willingness to look at their respective cultures with a critical lens, see where they've gone wrong in the past and where they can better themselves, and speak up no matter the cost. These younger, impassioned voices are the future, Cameron insists. Not because they were untouched by their origins, but because they are willing to carry those origins forward into something new. They're arguing for an evolution of the Na'vi way in response to war. Not because the Na'vi way is inherently broken, but because circumstances have drastically changed, and if they do not change, they will cease to exist. Now, the most common critique of the film is that it's just the Way of Water all over again, but longer, which is at best ungenerous and at worst in bad faith. The structural decision to echo beats from the earlier films lands somewhere closer to the strategy employed by The Force Awakens, using familiar architecture so the audience doesn't have to spend cognitive energy orienting themselves. It really is as simple as the fact that we haven't made the leap from the forest to the ocean that made Way of Water so distinct from the original, and the large-scale war and resource mining imagery is something we've not seen before. Sure, the scaffolding is recognizable, but everything built on top of it is not, and at the same time, these films should resemble an Avatar movie, so the fact that they've kind of figured out what an Avatar movie should look and feel like is actually a testament to the maturity of this franchise. Cameron knows that if you trust your audience to absorb the skeleton quickly, you can spend the rest of the runtime putting meat on the bones, which makes for the most thematically dense and character-rich installment in a franchise that grows deeper with every outing. This is a film that adds a immense dimension to characters who appeared in the first 2 installments to be broad archetypes and does it without announcing that it's doing so. The complexity accumulates. By the time you realized how nuanced it's gotten, the film is done and you have no choice but to dive back in. Now, what holds Fire and Ash together structurally, emotionally, and thematically is grief. Specifically, the film's insistence that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a force that permanently reshapes the people it moves through. Neteyam's death has irreversibly transformed both of his parents. As discussed previously, Neytiri is consumed by fury, and Jake becomes emotionally stunted and practical to a fault. The Ash people's rage-fueled nihilism is the same dynamic taken to its terminal conclusion. What happens when grief is never metabolized, only weaponized. And critically, the film refuses the comforts of restoration. Characters grow, sure, but they never return to who they were. Their grief continues to shape their choices. That which is transformed cannot be untransformed. The resolution Cameron builds toward is not a triumph over grief, but an integration of it. An understanding, a realization that every one of these characters is changed forever and must learn how to live in that new reality. Similarly to how colonialism impacts its environment and the change it forces onto the status quo. It's not a good thing, and there's a sense of the characters wanting to go back to a familiar place. But unfortunately, it is one of those cases where the genie has been let out of the bottle, so how do you navigate going forward? How do you learn to live in this new landscape? Jake embraces his destiny as Taruk Maktal because he has come to understand that refusing the mantle is its own form of destruction. Neytiri moves painfully and with great hesitation toward an acceptance of Spider that her grief had rendered nearly impossible. Kiri learns to embrace a deity that had previously shut her out. Spider earns, in a film that places him quite literally at the emotional center, his place among the people through courage and sacrifice. The film's argument is not that these characters are healed per se. It is that they have chosen consciously and at cost not to let their grief make the next decision for them. That's not the same as being healed. It is so much harder than being healed. But there is a way to grow and make peace with the wounds that scar us. I think the scene that crystallizes these ideas is the scene with Jake and Spider in the meadow. You can see the pain on Jake's face as he walks Spider into a clearing, knife barely concealed and at the ready. As an audience member, you're gripping the armrest as you see this innocent child kneeling for execution. This is the first time Jake has succumbed to the potential for unforgivable violence that Neytiri has been wrestling with the entire film. Perhaps most heartbreaking is the fact that this comes right after Spider has saved them. In the same moment, Neytiri suddenly pulls back. She has pushed far enough to see what she has become and correcting course at the last possible moment. The film puts both of its protagonists in their worst selves simultaneously, forces them to look within, and then trusts them to find their way back. Cameron doesn't flinch or dumb down the shocking peril these characters have found themselves in and the darkness that envelops the entire scene. I mean, sure, I guess we can assume that Jake isn't going to do an unforgivable thing and kill Spider, but the moment feels real. The thoughts that Jake was going through feel real. And it gave that scene so much weight and power because it's not merely potential violence that could happen. No, it's an existential unraveling and a creative choice that can only be made by a filmmaker who trusts their audience to feel something real. In many ways, Fire and Ash is an argument for the preservation of Cameron's fearless knack for filmmaking. His storytelling sensibilities are rooted in the 80s and 90s blockbuster tradition. Clear structure, archetypal but layered characters, emotional directness, and melodrama deployed in earnest without embarrassment. Cameron is not irony poison. He's not afraid of cringe. He stages Loak's darkest moment contemplating suicide without cutting away from it. He stages the marital arguments between Jake and Neytiri with the texture of microaggressions and half-held punches, both characters simultaneously right and wrong in ways that feel uncomfortably real. He trusts the audience to handle it. Cameron's design philosophy, from striking silhouettes to functional iconography and instant legibility, no matter how dynamic the composition, means that the Na'vi neural cues, the Ash people's ceremonial markings, the Tolkuen's ornamentation all read immediately and reveal their complexity the longer you sit with them. The set pieces sequences are built on character stakes rather than pure visual escalation. The floating mountain final battle works because we understand exactly what every person in it is fighting for, and those motivations are in conflict with each other in ways the choreography expresses. Now, the film isn't without its vulnerabilities. The Wind Traders are introduced with an amazing set piece and then more or less abandoned. Their moral ambiguity is the most interesting variation the film adds to the Na'vi world, and it deserves more than the space it gets. Certain character dynamics among the Sully children are sketched rather than developed, relying on the audience's investment from the Way of Water to fill in connective tissue that the film hasn't entirely laid down. And there are moments in the second act where the accumulation of plot, always a tenuous balance for Cameron, threatens to outpace the emotional grounding. I mean, this is definitely the most unwieldy Avatar film Cameron has made, but I will take an ambitious swing that mostly delivers over a film that is neat and forgettable any day of the week. There's a version of the conversation about these films that focuses exclusively on their cultural footprint. The box office, the technology, the years between installments, you've heard it all before. That conversation is an understandable necessity, but I think it misses the more interesting point. Fire and Ash is not remarkable because of what it cost or how long it took or what it will make. It's remarkable because it's a mainstream blockbuster that has made billions of dollars while genuinely and rigorously interrogating multiculturalism, grief, and the cycles of violence that colonialism perpetuates across generations. It's thinking about things with the full weight of its craft and its spectacle behind them, not as some decorative layer over the real entertainment, but as the entertainment itself. This is rarer than it should be, and rarer than the discourse around it acknowledges. Cameron's stubbornness, which is not insignificant, is ultimately the quality that makes these films feel singular. He only changes course when he believes it's right creatively and is not interested in what's fashionable in a given moment, nor does he sand down the edges to make something more broadly palatable. The result is a film that feels like they were made by a single mind with a singular vision, which, in a landscape of committee-polished franchise product, is almost disorienting. You can feel the authorship here more than any other franchise I think we have going on at the moment. You can feel someone at the keyboard working through ideas they've been mulling over for a decade, refusing to let the commercial apparatus digest the thing before it's ready. Whatever else you want to say about the Avatar films, they don't feel like a product. They feel like James Cameron had something to say about the world and refused to leave the room until he said it. The comparison to the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy isn't just about the spectacle or the structure or how epic it is. I mean, At World's End is arguably the most derided entry in the franchise. But on top of that being the wrong opinion, At World's End rules, it's a film that commits so completely to the operatic, consequence-laden logic it has built over the last two installments that it becomes genuinely strange. In fact, it was too strange for audiences who came expecting the breezy pleasures of the first film. Fire and Ash is operating in that same territory. It's been building toward this level of thematic density and character complexity across 15 years of real time and 3 films of narrative time. The audience that has been patient enough to stay with it is now being rewarded with a film that respects their investment and builds on it without pausing to re-explain itself. That's a goddamn gift, man. What Fire and Ash ultimately argues is that the only path through grief, through cultural collision, through the inherited damage of colonialism is the hardest one. Not resolution, not erasure, not the fantasy of if we expel the colonizer and restore the land to its original state, that we can pretend the wound never happened. The wound did happen. The fire happened. The question becomes, what can we build from the ash? Cameron doesn't answer that question, at least not simply. He's too smart to pretend the answer is readily available because it's something we're clearly still working through today as a civilization. For Cameron, the scale of the question dictates the scale of the exploration, and he will settle for nothing less than an epic journey. His hope is that maybe you walk out of the theater and look at your kids differently. Maybe you look at your parents differently. Maybe you look at your community differently. The myth of Prometheus, which Cameron has been circling for his entire career without quite naming it, is not simply that Prometheus defied the gods, it's that he kept bringing the fire even after the punishment, because the fire was worth more than the comfort of his chains. Cameron absolutely brought the fire with Avatar 3. He scorched his own hands in the process, and what remains is an uncompromising work, unlike anything in the present homogeneous media landscape. It is, for the real Avatar fans, a damn near spiritual text.